Mum's finally hanging up her apron, my son, Mark, said to the young woman from the local paper. Time for some fresh ideas around here. His voice was loud and cheerful over the party noise. The flash from the reporter's camera blinked, and for a second, I saw only white. I was standing in the middle of my own bakery, the flower pot, holding a slice of cake on a flimsy paper plate. The air smelled of sugar and yeast, the same smells that had been my life for 40 years. But something was wrong. My friends from church and the neighbours I'd known forever were all smiling at me. They thought this was a retirement party. I thought so too, until Mark's words hit me. I looked at the new banner hanging over the counter. It didn't say, "Happy Retirement, Eleanor." It had a new logo, a sleek, black thing I'd never seen before, with the words, "The Flower Pot, a New Generation." A cold feeling, like swallowing ice, spread through my chest. This wasn't a party. It was an eviction notice. My daughter, Sarah, drove me home. She kept her eyes on the road, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The car was quiet, except for the low hum of the engine and the crinkle of the party favour bag in my lap. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside. A single cupcake made from a box mix. I could smell the chemical vanilla from here. When we pulled into my driveway, she turned off the car, but didn't look at me. "Mark thought this would be for the best, Mom," she said softly, staring at the garage door. She reached into her purse and pulled out a glossy brochure. She placed it in my hand. The cover showed smiling seniors playing shuffleboard. "Golden Years Village," it said. "We just want you to be able to relax." I took the brochure. Its pages were smooth and cold. She still wouldn't meet my eyes. The next morning, I woke up at 4, just like I always did. My hands reached for the phone to call the bakery and check on the overnight proofing. It was a habit as deep as breathing. The phone felt cool in my hand. It rang twice before Mark picked up. His voice was thick with sleep and annoyance. "Mum? What's wrong?" "Nothing, dear. I was just calling about the dough." There was a long sigh on the other end. "Mum, you need to relax. We've got it handled. We have a new system." He paused. "And listen, you won't need your key to the shop anymore. We're changing the locks today for the new insurance policy." Another pause. "It just won't be necessary." Then he hung up. I stood in my silent kitchen, the smell of last night's flour still clinging to my sweater. I checked my bank account on my little tablet, a Friday morning ritual. My weekly pension deposit from the business wasn't there. Later that day, I couldn't stop myself. I put on my coat and walked the 3 blocks to the town square. The wind was sharp. They had already taken down my old hand-painted sign. The new one was black and silver, like something from the city. It looked cold. I stood across the street, half hidden by the big oak tree, and looked through the window. My heart sank. They were scooping my famous cinnamon roll filling from a big plastic bucket. It was a commercial mix. A piece of me shriveled up right there on the sidewalk. A warm hand touched my arm. It was my friend Margaret from the church bake sale committee. She followed my gaze to the bakery window, then looked back at my face. Her expression was full of pity. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled faintly of mothballs and peppermint. "What have those children done?" The pension deposit finally showed up on Monday. I opened my banking app, my thumb trembling a little over the screen. The number that appeared was half of what it should have been. Half. I called Mark right away. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and businesslike. "Mum, I was going to call you about that. It's a necessary business adjustment. The old numbers just weren't sustainable." "But Mark, That's what I live on, I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. My social security doesn't cover everything. You should be grateful we can give you anything at all, he said, and the condescension in his voice was a physical slap. The business needs to grow. If you're short, maybe you should apply for some of those senior assistance programs. I hear they can be very helpful. A letter arrived in the afternoon mail. It was in a thick, cream-coloured envelope, with the name of a downtown law firm embossed in the corner. My hands felt cold as I slit it open with a butter knife. The paper was heavy and stiff. The words were legal jargon, a forest of them, but the meaning was as clear as a punch to the gut. They were offering me a small, insulting sum for my remaining shares in the bakery. A pittance, really, for 40 years of my life. A little clause at the bottom said I had 1 week to sign. The phone rang, making me jump. It was Sarah. Her voice was thick, like she'd been holding back tears all day. "Mom, did you get a letter?" "I did," I said, my own voice flat. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, and then she started to cry for real. Mark made me agree. He said it was a necessary business adjustment. He said it was the only way. I didn't say anything. I just listened to the sound of my daughter crying over a decision she had helped make. The silence between us felt 100 miles wide. After I hung up with Sarah, I couldn't sit still. The lawyer's letter sat on my kitchen table, looking like a threat. I walked to the hall closet and pulled out the big, heavy photo albums from the top shelf. The plastic covers were crackly and smelled faintly of dust. I sat in my armchair, the lamp casting a warm circle of light. I turned the stiff pages. There I was, 28 years old, my face smudged with flour. I was holding a giant ring of keys, grinning in front of the tiny storefront that would become the flower pot. So much hope in that smile. On the next page, a tiny Mark, no older than 5, stood on a stool, his nose dotted with dough. Little Sarah was beside him, clapping her hands, her eyes wide with wonder. The sweetness of the memory was so sharp, it hurt. I leaned forward and put my head in my hands, the grief washing over me. But then I looked again at that young woman with the keys. She looked so strong, so sure of herself. And a different feeling started to glow in the pit of my stomach. It was small, but it was hot. It was anger. They had no right to take that from her. From me. The anger had cooled by morning, but it left behind a kind of cold resolve. I had to know exactly where I stood. I put on my walking shoes and headed to the bank downtown. The church bells were ringing for 10 o'clock. The sound was comforting and familiar. Inside the bank, the air conditioning hummed, a welcome relief from the summer heat. The teller, Jessica, was a sweet girl I'd known since she was in pigtails. "Mrs. Vance, good to see you," she said with a bright smile. "You too, Jessica. I just need to check my savings balance if you don't mind." She typed for a moment and then printed a little white slip of paper. She slid it across the counter. I looked at the number. It was less than I thought. Much less. Years of helping Mark with a down payment, helping Sarah with the kids' braces. It had all added up. Or rather, subtracted. Jessica leaned forward, her voice a little lower. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Vance? We all miss seeing you at the flower pot. It's not the same." I forced a small smile. "Things change, dear." Walking home, her words echoed in my head. It's not the same. So the town was talking. The story my children were telling wasn't the whole truth, and people were starting to notice. That night, I had a terrible dream. I was standing in my kitchen. The counters were covered in bags of flour, bowls of sugar, sticks of butter. All the right ingredients. But my hands wouldn't work. I reached for the flour. and my fingers felt like clumsy wooden pegs. I tried to remember the recipe for my morning glory muffins, a recipe I knew better than my own name, but my mind was just a blank, white page. I was useless. I woke up with a gasp. My nightgown was damp with a cold sweat. The red numbers on my digital clock glowed, 3:17 a.m. The house was completely silent. I slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to the kitchen. Moonlight streamed through the window, making pale squares on the linoleum floor. I reached out and touched the cool, smooth metal of my stand mixer. My hands felt empty, and for the first time, I truly believed them. "Time for some fresh ideas," Mark had said. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had nothing left to offer. Maybe I really was just an old woman who had forgotten how to do the one thing she was ever good at. The next few days were a blur. I felt like I was moving through thick grey fog. The feeling of being old and useless was a heavy blanket I couldn't shake off. I decided to do what Mark had suggested. I would start cleaning out the house, preparing to downsize. It was a practical task, something to keep my hands busy. I pulled down the creaky folding stairs to the attic. The air that drifted down was warm and smelled of cedar and old paper. I started with a stack of boxes in the corner. Old tax documents, my late husband Robert's college textbooks. It was slow, sad work. My hand, dusty from the cardboard, brushed against something hard and solid tucked deep inside a box of Robert's old files. It was wrapped in a piece of faded oilcloth. Curious, I pulled it out. It was a book, a heavy, leather-bound journal, the cover cracked and worn smooth with time. With fingers that trembled just a little, I unwrapped it and opened to the first page. There, in my own looping, youthful handwriting, were 5 words. Eleanor's recipes, the real ones. It was my original recipe book, the one with all my secrets, the one I thought I had lost forever. I opened the book. The air filled with the faint smell of vanilla and old paper, a scent I thought I had lost forever. The leather cover was soft under my fingers. Inside, on the yellowed pages, was my own handwriting. My notes were scribbled in the margins, little secrets about a pinch more nutmeg, or letting the dough rest 5 extra minutes by the warm stove. Everything was there. The real recipe for the cinnamon rolls, the one that needed a starter I fed like a pet. The secret to my morning glory muffins, which wasn't just the pineapple, but the way you toasted the coconut first. These were the things I never wrote down at the bakery. I kept them in my head and in this book. My children had the business, but they didn't have the heart of it. The spark of anger I'd felt started to catch. It wasn't a wildfire, but a low, steady flame in my chest. This book was mine. The recipes were mine. My name was Eleanor Vance, and I knew how to bake. The next morning, I walked to the grocery store. I didn't use a cart. I carried a basket on my arm, the way I used to. I bought butter, the expensive kind wrapped in foil. I bought real vanilla extract, not the imitation stuff. I bought bags of flour and sugar, and their weight in my basket felt solid and real. Back in my kitchen, my hands trembled a little as I measured out the flour. It had been weeks, but soon the old motions came back. The soft give of the dough under my palms, the familiar hum of my old oven warming up. I made a small batch of my morning glory muffins, just 6 of them. As they baked, the house began to change. The silence filled with a warm, sweet smell of cinnamon and melting butter. It smelled like my home again, not just a place I was waiting to leave. It smelled like me. Just as I pulled the golden brown muffins from the oven, there was a knock on my back door. It was my neighbour, Mr. Henderson, sniffing the air from his yard. I opened the door, and Mr. Henderson smiled. He was a widower, a kind man who mostly kept to himself. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I don't mean to be nosy, but that smell could raise the dead." I laughed, a real laugh that came from my belly. I wrapped a warm muffin in a napkin and handed it to him. "Here, you be the judge." He took a bite. His eyes, which were usually a little sad, went wide. He chewed slowly, then took another, bigger bite. "My goodness," he said, his mouth full. He swallowed. "Eleanor, this is 10 times better than the dry thing they're selling at the flower pot now. It's not even close." He told me his book club was meeting the next day and asked if I'd be willing to bake a dozen for him. He'd pay, of course. I looked past him, at the crisp autumn leaves skittering across my lawn. My children thought the secret was in the flower. They forgot the secret was me. An idea, small and quiet, started to take root. I didn't take Mr. Henderson's money, but I baked his muffins. Then I baked another dozen, and then a batch of my simple sugar cookies. I wrapped them in little wax paper bags tied with string. I took a bag to Margaret at church. Her face lit up. "Oh, Eleanor, it tastes like a memory." I gave a bag to the young woman at the bank, the one who always asked about my grandchildren. "My mum always said yours were the best," she said, her smile genuine. I left a bag for the mailman in my mailbox with a little note. Everywhere I went, I gave them away as small gifts. The response was always the same. People's eyes would soften. They'd tell me how they missed the old bakery, how things had changed. "This is what we miss," they'd say, over and over. "This taste." Each time they said it, the little idea in my mind grew a bit stronger. That evening, I pulled a dusty accordion file from the back of my hall closet. It was full of old papers I hadn't looked at in years. My late husband's military records, the deed to our house, and tucked in the very back, a thick manila envelope. Inside were my original business incorporation documents from 40 years ago. The paper was brittle, the typewritten words slightly faded. I sat at my kitchen table under the bright light, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I read the fine print, my finger tracing the complicated legal words. And then I saw it. I had signed over the business name, The Flower Pot. I had signed over the building lease and the equipment, but I had never, not once, signed over the rights to my personal name or to the recipes themselves. They were never listed as company assets. They had always just been mine. A tiny flicker of hope, sharp and clear, lit up the quiet room. I made an appointment at the legal aid office downtown. The waiting room smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, and the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed in my ears. A young man in a slightly wrinkled suit called my name. He looked like he was still in school. He led me to a small, cluttered office. I placed my old business documents and my leather-bound recipe book on his desk. My hands were shaking a little. He listened without interrupting, his eyes kind. He carefully turned the pages of my book, reading my handwritten notes. "They took the name, the building, the equipment," I said, my voice quiet. "They said I was too old for the business." He looked up from the book, his expression serious. "But did you ever sign over the rights to these specific recipes, Mrs. Vance?" I shook my head. "They're mine." "Then they are yours," he said simply. "They are your personal intellectual property." A wave of relief washed over me, so strong I had to grip the arms of the chair. He smiled gently. "They told you that you were too old for the business. It seems they forgot you were the business." The young lawyer leaned forward, tapping a finger on the cover of my book. "So, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice full of possibility. "What do you plan to do with them?" A few days later, my son Mark called. I knew from the sharp, clipped way he said, "Mum," that this was not a social call. I could hear the clatter of dishes and the hiss of an espresso machine in the background of his new, modern bakery. "People are talking," he said, his voice tight with irritation. "Margaret from church told someone you gave her muffins, and now half the town thinks you're giving out free samples. It's confusing our customers." I sat at my kitchen table, looking out at the little bird feeder in my yard. I kept my voice as smooth and even as cream. "They're just gifts for my friends, dear." "Well, it needs to stop," he snapped. "It's unprofessional. It's hurting the brand." "I see," I said. I took a slow sip of my tea. "Goodbye, Mark." I hung up the phone before he could say another word. The quiet click of the receiver settling into its cradle was the most satisfying sound I had heard all week. Instead of staying home, I started taking a walk around the town square every morning. The air was cool, and the church bells chimed on the hour. I watched the morning rush at the flower pot from a bench near the fountain. I saw my old customers go in, and I saw them come out, their faces a little disappointed. One morning, my eyes landed on something I'd never really noticed before. Tucked between the pharmacy and the insurance office was a tiny, empty storefront. It used to be a watch repair shop. The windows were dusty, and a faded, handwritten "For Rent" sign was taped to the inside of the glass. It was directly across the street from the flower pot. I stood up from my bench and walked over. I cupped my hands and peered through the grime. It was small, no bigger than my living room, but the morning sun poured right through the front window. A little idea, as small and hard as a seed, began to feel like it might have a place to grow. My hand trembled as I dialed the number on the rental sign. A gruff voice answered. I asked about the little shop. He told me the monthly rent. The number made my breath catch in my throat. It was high, more than my social security check and the pittance of a pension my son was sending me combined. "I'll have to think about it," I said, trying to sound businesslike. That afternoon, I pulled out the old metal box where I kept my important papers. I spread everything out on the dining room table. My Medicare statements, the reduced pension slips, my bank records, the title to my little house. The floral scent of my rose garden drifted in through the open window, but all I could smell was old paper and ink. I sat there for hours with a pencil and a pad, adding and subtracting. It was a terrifying puzzle. For the first time, it didn't feel like I was just tidying up my affairs. It felt like I was putting together a battle plan. Sarah showed up that evening. She didn't call first. She looked pale and tired, the skin around her eyes stretched thin. She sat stiffly on my sofa, refusing the cup of tea I offered. The expensive perfume she wore couldn't cover the smell of stress. "Business is down, Mum," she said, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. "The reviews online, they're not good. People are saying the cinnamon rolls taste like cardboard." I just nodded, waiting. Her voice cracked. Could you just tell people to give us another chance? Tell them the new recipes are good. It would mean a lot, coming from you." I looked at my daughter, at the stranger she had become. I thought of the assisted living brochure she had given me. "I can't do that, Sarah," I said, my voice soft but firm. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on my kitchen table. My old recipe book was still lying open, held down by a salt shaker. I watched all the colour drain from her face. I went to the local credit union the next day. I wore my good navy blue blazer, the one I saved for church holidays. My old leather recipe book felt heavy and important in my bag, like a Bible. I sat across a shiny desk from a young man named Kevin. His tie was a little too tight. I laid out my plan for a small cafe. I showed him my numbers. I even opened the recipe book to the page for my morning glory muffins. The air in his little office smelled like stale coffee and air freshener. He smiled a thin, polite smile. Mrs. Vance, this is a lovely idea. He folded his hands on the desk. But it's a big risk at your age. A very big risk. His words hung in the air, cold and sharp. At my age, the same tune my children sang. I gathered my papers, my hands steady, and walked out into the afternoon sun feeling dismissed, but not defeated. I called Margaret as soon as I got home. She came over with her old adding machine, the kind that makes a satisfying clunk and whir. We sat at my kitchen table, the scent of the lemon polish I'd used that morning still faint in the air. We drank chamomile tea from my good china cups. A big risk at his age is what he should be worried about, Margaret grumbled, tapping the keys with her nimble fingers. He's never tasted your cinnamon rolls. She helped me refine my business plan. We calculated everything, from the cost of a single egg to the price of paper napkins. We made a new budget that was lean and smart. We'll show them the numbers, Eleanor, she said, her voice firm. Numbers don't have an age. The next day, we went back to the credit union together. We didn't ask for Kevin. We asked for his manager. We were prepared. I would not be dismissed again. The call came 2 days later. My hand trembled a little as I picked up the phone. It was the credit union manager. Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice much warmer this time. Your loan has been approved. It was a small loan, just enough to get started, but it felt like $1 million. I signed the lease for the tiny watch repair shop that same afternoon. The landlord, a man even older than me, shook my hand firmly. He handed me a single, cold, brass key. I held it tight in my palm all the way home. It felt heavy, like a weapon. Or maybe, like a promise. This was the first real step. I felt a terrifying, thrilling hum deep in my bones. The next morning, I painted a small sign on a piece of clean plywood. The white paint was thick and smelled clean. In my neatest handwriting, I wrote, Eleanor's Nook, coming soon. Mr. Henderson helped me hang it in the window of the dusty little shop. Then I went and sat on a bench in the town square, right across the street. The wood felt rough under my hands. The church bells rang for 9 o'clock. I just sat and waited. Soon I saw them. Mark and Sarah, walking out of the flower pot for their morning coffee break. They stopped dead on the sidewalk. Mark pointed. Sarah put a hand over her mouth. Even from across the street, I could feel the wave of their shock. I knew it was only a matter of time. He didn't even wait for dinner. Mark's car screeched to a stop in my driveway just after lunch. The screen door slammed behind him, making the little bell on it jingle wildly. He stood in my kitchen, his face red and tight. The air smelled of the rain that had just started to fall outside. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "You're trying to destroy us." I stayed calm, wiping a clean plate with a dish towel. The familiar motion soothed me. I looked him right in the eye. "I'm just opening a little cafe, Mark. It's a free country." "A cafe? Directly across the street?" He sputtered. "This is a betrayal. I'll sue you. I'll sue you for everything you have left." I spent that next week in a cloud of paint fumes and sawdust. The little shop smelled of fresh primer and old wood. Mr. Henderson, my neighbor, came over every morning. He smelled like coffee and pipe tobacco. He helped me build simple pine shelves behind the counter. His hands, though wrinkled, were steady and strong. "These will hold a lot of muffins, Eleanor," he said, tapping a finished shelf. It made a solid, satisfying sound. Margaret came by in the afternoons after her water aerobics class. She'd sit at the one little table I'd bought, her calculator clicking away. "We'll keep the books simple," she told me, adjusting her glasses. "No need for fancy software." People from town would press their faces to the glass window as they walked by. They'd cup their hands around their eyes to see inside. Some of them would give me a little wave and a smile. It felt like the whole town was holding its breath with me. One afternoon, I was sweeping up wood shavings. The mail carrier pushed a long white envelope through the slot in the door. It landed on the floor with a stiff little slap. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize. The knot in my stomach was back. The letter was a cease and desist. That's what it said, right at the top, in big, angry letters. It was from Mark and Sarah's lawyer. It accused me of using proprietary trade secrets from the flower pot. My cinnamon rolls, my muffins. They were claiming my own recipes belonged to them. The paper felt cold and slick in my hands. I called my young legal aid lawyer, my voice trembling just a little. "They're saying I can't bake my own food." He was quiet for a moment. I could hear the hum of his office air conditioner over the phone. "Don't you worry, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Let me handle this." The next day, he sent them a letter back. It was very short. It just said that the recipes were created by me, Eleanor Vance, long before the flower pot ever existed. They were my personal property. He attached a copy of a page from my handwritten book, dated 1978. It was the recipe for the Morning Glory muffins. It was checkmate. Opening day was a Tuesday. I woke up at 4 in the morning, long before the sun. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I was terrified. What if no one came? What if my children were right, and I was just a foolish old woman? I put on my apron, the fabric soft and familiar against my clothes. I only had 3 things on the menu: my simple, strong coffee, the Morning Glory muffins, and my original cinnamon rolls, the ones that smelled like heaven. I unlocked the door to Eleanor's nook at exactly 6 o'clock. The little bell I'd hung over the door gave a cheerful jingle. For 15 minutes, nothing happened. I stood behind the counter, my hands clasped together, watching the empty street. Then, I saw Mr. Henderson crossing the square. A few minutes later, Margaret arrived. Then the young bank teller. By 6:15, there was a line, a real line, stretching out the door and onto the sidewalk. I sold out of everything by 9 o'clock. Every last muffin, every single cinnamon roll. The shelves Mr. Henderson had built were completely bare. My little shop was filled with the warm, happy sounds of people chatting. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and cinnamon. People who couldn't get a seat inside were sitting on the steps, holding a warm pastry in a little wax paper bag. They were just happy to be there. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands shaking a little. I walked to my front window and looked across the street. The flower pot, with its sleek new sign, was almost empty. I could see Mark through the glass, standing with his arms crossed. The quiet hum in my chest wasn't just victory. It felt like coming home. The local newspaper ran a story 2 days later. It was on the front page of the Town Life section. The headline read, "Founder of the Flower Pot returns with her original recipes." The reporter had been very kind. He wrote about my 40 years of baking for the town, about the recipes I'd created in my own kitchen. The article didn't say a single mean word about Mark or Sarah. It didn't have to. It painted me as a beloved town icon who had simply come out of retirement. The truth was there, right between the lines, for everyone to read. My children did not come out looking very good. That evening, just as I was locking up, there was a soft knock on the glass door of the shop. I turned, and my heart gave a little jump. It was Sarah, standing alone on the sidewalk. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red. She looked like she had been crying for hours. My daughter Sarah stood on my porch, twisting the strap of her purse. The evening air was cool, smelling of cut grass from Mr. Henderson's lawn. Her face was puffy and blotchy, the way it got when she was a little girl and had cried herself sick. "It was Mark," she whispered, not looking at me. "He pushed me into everything. He said you were losing your touch, that the bakery needed fresh ideas." I just listened. The hum of my old refrigerator was the only other sound. I didn't open the screen door all the way. Can I come work for you?" she asked, her voice cracking. "At the Nook, I miss it. I miss how it used to be." I looked at my daughter, a grown woman with a mortgage and children of her own, and I felt a deep, quiet sadness. I thought of the long days, the lonely nights, the feeling of being erased. I thought of the little key to the shop that was no longer necessary. "No, dear," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "This is something I have to do for myself." I closed the wooden door, and the click of the lock felt clean and solid. It wasn't a victory, not really. It was just a boundary, drawn in the dust of a life I was rebuilding. The line outside Eleanor's Nook started before the sun came up. It snaked past the hardware store and around the corner. Inside, the little shop was a whirlwind of warmth and noise. The rich smell of coffee mingled with the sweet, buttery scent of my cinnamon rolls. Ceramic mugs clinked against saucers. Happy chatter filled the air. "Best roll I've had in 40 years, Eleanor," Mr. Henderson boomed from his usual table. I just smiled and nodded. My hands, which had once felt so useless, were now covered in a fine dusting of flour. They moved with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. I had to hire a young woman from the community college, Chloe, just to handle the register and the coffee urn. She was a quick learner, with bright eyes and a ready smile. "Mrs. Vance, the phone's been ringing all morning. People want to place orders for next week." I looked out the window at the line of my neighbours, my friends, all waiting patiently. I looked across the street at the flower pot, where two lonely customers sat by the window. My quiet revenge wasn't loud or angry. It was the smell of cinnamon and the sound of a full house. I walked into the credit union on a Tuesday afternoon. The air smelled of recycled air conditioning and old paper. The vinyl chair in front of Mr. Gable's desk gave a little squeak when I sat down. I placed a check on his desk. It was for the entire remaining balance of my small business loan. He put on his reading glasses and looked at it, then at me. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice full of surprise, "you've paid this off in 6 months. The term was for 3 years." "Business has been good," I said. It was the biggest understatement of my life. He stamped my receipt with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Paid in full." The ink was a deep, beautiful blue. Walking out into the bright sunshine, I felt a lightness in my chest. I looked at my hands, the knuckles a little swollen with arthritis, the skin thin and papery. These hands had earned my freedom. For the first time, I felt truly independent, and a new thought began to form. What does a free woman do next? The lawyer's office was quiet and smelled of lemon polish and old books. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. I sat across a large, polished desk from a man in a crisp suit. "So, to be clear, Mrs. Vance," he said, peering at me over his spectacles, "the non-voting shares in the bakery corporation and your residual assets will bypass your son and daughter entirely?" "That's right," I said, my voice steady. "It will all go into a trust, for my grandchildren's education, directly to them." The lawyer, Mr. Davison, steepled his fingers. "Your children will not be pleased when they find out." A small smile touched my lips. I thought of the brochure for the Golden Years facility, of the condescending tone in Mark's voice. Pleasing them, I said softly, is no longer my primary concern. He pushed the documents toward me. I picked up the heavy fountain pen, and the scratch of it on the thick paper was the only sound. The ink was dark and final. I was protecting my legacy, not just my recipes, for a generation that might actually appreciate it. The kitchen was warm and humid before dawn, smelling of yeast and sugar. Chloe stood beside me at the big wooden kneading table. Her dark hair already had a dusting of flour in it. I had the old leather-bound recipe book open on a stand beside us. The secret isn't just the ingredients, Chloe, I said, guiding her hand over the soft dough. It's the temperature of the butter. It has to feel like this. Cool, but not hard. This book, it's like magic, Mrs. Vance, she whispered, her eyes wide as she read my spidery handwriting. It's not magic, I chuckled. It's just 40 years of paying attention. She felt more like family to me in that moment than my own children had in a long time. Later, as the first customers were coming in, Chloe was wiping down the counter. She stopped and stared at her phone. Her eyes grew wide. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice hushed. "You need to see this." She held up the phone. It was a review from a famous food blogger from the city. The headline read, "Is the best cinnamon roll in the state hiding in a grandmother's tiny cafe?" The food blogger's review changed things. Suddenly, people were driving from 2 towns over, holding their phones up to my window to make sure they had the right place. The line was a permanent fixture on the sidewalk from 6:30 in the morning until I put the "sold out" sign in the door. I felt a hum in my bones I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the frantic buzz of my old life. It was the steady, warm energy of purpose. "I drove an hour for one of your cinnamon rolls," a woman in a bright pink coat told me one morning. "My mother used to bring me to the flower pot for my birthday every year. This tastes just like I remember." I had to expand. I started adding one new thing from my leather-bound book each week. A lemon poppy seed loaf one week, a pecan sticky bun the next. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. My old aches and pains seemed to fade away, replaced by the satisfying tiredness that comes from a day well spent. I didn't feel old. I felt like myself again. One Tuesday afternoon, the little bell over my door jingled. I looked up from wiping the counter and my heart gave a little squeeze. It was Mark. He stood there awkwardly, looking out of place among the warm wood and happy chatter of my little shop. He wouldn't meet my eye. He just stared at the menu board I'd hand-painted myself. "Mom," he started. He cleared his throat. "We need to talk." I just kept wiping the counter, my motions slow and even. "I'm listening, Mark. This whole situation, it's causing a lot of brand damage," he said, finally looking at me. His eyes were tired. "People are confused. Our numbers are down. Way down." He took a breath. "I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding about your retirement." A misunderstanding. That's what he called it. The coldness of that party. The brochure for the nursing home. The condescending tone on the phone. A misunderstanding. I stopped wiping the counter and looked straight at my son. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "I have to get back to my customers, Mark," I said, and turned to help the next person in line. From my front window, I had a perfect view of the flower pot. It was like watching a flower wilt in real time. First, a big, garish sign appeared in their window. "Sale, 50% off." Then, they tried to copy my morning glory muffins. I could tell just by looking at them. They were pale and flat. They didn't have the secret. Margaret sat with me one morning before I opened, sipping her tea from the chipped blue mug she claimed as her own. "You feel bad?" she asked, nodding her head toward the empty bakery across the street. I thought about it for a moment, watching the weak morning light hit their new, sterile sign. I felt a pang of something, a sadness for the 40 years of memories I had built in that building. But it was like mourning a house I used to live in, not the home I had now. "No," I said, my voice quiet but sure. "I don't feel guilty. They made their bed. I just wished they hadn't used my good linens to do it. My real family became the people who gathered in my shop. Margaret, who still helped with my books. Mr. Henderson, who brought me flowers from his garden for the tables. The young bank teller, who came by every day for her coffee and a chat. Even Chloe, my young assistant, who soaked up every lesson like a sponge and whose laughter filled the tiny kitchen. We had a little ritual. Every morning, before I flipped the sign to "Open," we'd all sit at the corner table. We'd drink coffee and talk about the town gossip or the weather. Sometimes we wouldn't talk at all, just enjoying the comfortable silence and the smell of baking bread. One morning, Mr. Henderson looked around the little group and smiled. "You know, Eleanor," he said, "this is the nicest club in town." I looked at their faces, these friends who had shown up for me without question. He was right. This small room held more warmth and honesty than any holiday dinner I'd attended in the last 10 years. Then, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, but I recognized Sarah's shaky handwriting. My hands trembled a little as I opened it. It wasn't typed. It was 3 pages, front and back, written by hand. She wrote about her guilt, about how she let Mark bully her, about how she missed the mother she used to know. It wasn't an excuse. It was an apology. It was the first honest thing she had said to me in months. I invited her for coffee that evening, after I had closed up the shop. The cafe was quiet, with only the hum of the cooling ovens. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped. We just sat for a long time, the silence broken by the clink of our spoons against our cups. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. It was all about the money for Mark. He was so afraid of failing. I just nodded, letting her talk. "He took out a second mortgage on his house to keep the flower pot going," she said, her voice barely audible. "He's going to lose everything." I decided to close my cafe on Sundays and Mondays. The idea came to me one Saturday evening. The last customer had left, and the air was thick with the lingering smell of sugar and cooling bread. Chloe was wiping down the counter, humming along to a song on the little radio we kept by the sink. I looked at her, so young and full of energy, and then I looked at my own hands, resting on the worn wooden table. They were good hands, but they were the hands of a 70-year-old woman. "Chloe," I said, "starting next week, we're closing on Sundays and Mondays." She stopped wiping and turned to me, her brow furrowed with worry. "Is business slowing down? Are we okay, Mrs. Vance?" I smiled. It was a real, gentle smile. "Business is wonderful, dear. That's why we're closing. A woman my age needs her weekends." It felt good to say it out loud. This wasn't about being too old for the work. It was about being wise enough to enjoy the life I was building. This was my new life, and it would be lived on my terms. The first Monday I had off, I was sitting on my porch with a cup of tea when a car I didn't recognize pulled up to the curb. A man in a crisp suit got out. He looked up at my house, then walked up the path. It was Mr. Peterson, the man who owned the building the flower pot was in. "Eleanor," he said, stopping at the bottom of my steps. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Robert. It's my day off." I said, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. He didn't sit. He just stood there, looking uncomfortable. I'll be direct, he said. Your children, well, they're 2 months behind on the rent for the bakery space. He let that hang in the air for a moment. The hum of a lawnmower started up down the street. I'd rather have a tenant who pays her bills on time. The space is yours if you want it back. I stared at him. Then my eyes drifted across the town square to my old bakery. The windows looked dark and empty. He was offering me the chance to go back, to erase what they had done, to take back my throne. The offer hung in the air, heavy and tempting. I thought about his offer for a full day. I pictured myself back in that big kitchen, my kitchen. I could see the morning light hitting the big front windows just so. It would be the ultimate victory, proof that they never should have pushed me out. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt a cold knot in my stomach. That place wasn't just my kitchen anymore. It was the room where my son told a reporter I was finished. It was the place my daughter handed me a brochure for a nursing home. The memories were tainted now. The next morning, I called him. Mr. Peterson, it's Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, have you thought about my offer? He asked. I looked around my own little cafe, at the warm yellow walls and the 2 small tables where my friends gathered. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. It was peaceful. I appreciate the offer. I truly do, I said, my voice steady. But my little nook is just the right size for me. I hung up the phone and felt a wave of relief. I wasn't just reacting to them anymore. I was choosing my own future. With the extra money I was making, I wanted to do something good. Something that wasn't about the past, but about the future. I called my accountant, Margaret, and asked her about setting up a proper health insurance plan for Chloe. It was expensive, but it felt right. The next day, I sat down with Chloe before we opened. The smell of coffee was just beginning to fill the air. I slid a brochure across the table to her. Chloe, I said, I want you to have this. It's a good plan. It will cover everything. She looked down at the paper, then back up at me. Her eyes, usually so bright and cheerful, filled with tears. Mrs. Vance, thank you, she whispered. No one's ever done that for me before. A good baker needs steady hands, I told her, patting her arm. And that means good health. Building something good, not just successful, felt like the best kind of revenge. It was a quiet, warm hum in my chest, a feeling of rightness that no amount of money could buy. A week later, Margaret stopped by for her morning muffin. She sat at her usual table by the window, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking across the street. Well, Eleanor, she said softly, it looks like it's finally over. I followed her gaze. A large truck was parked in front of the flower pot. 2 men were loading the sleek, stainless steel counters and fancy espresso machine my son had been so proud of. Taped to the inside of the glass door was a sign, printed on cheap paper. For sale. They were selling everything off, piece by piece. The name, once the pride of our town, was now just a ghost on an empty storefront. I felt a strange quietness inside me, not joy, not even sadness. Just a final, heavy stillness. I turned back to my own counter, ready to start the day, when the little bell above my door chimed. I looked up. Standing there, looking lost and smaller than I had ever seen him, was my son, Mark. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up from wiping the counter. It was Mark. He stood there for a moment, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, surrounded by the warm smell of my baking. He didn't look at me. He looked at the menu board, a simple chalkboard I'd written out myself. He walked to the counter and put a $10 bill down. His hand was trembling just a little. A coffee and one of the muffins, please. I poured his coffee into one of my heavy ceramic mugs and placed a Morning Glory muffin on a plate. I didn't say a word. I just pushed the plate and mug toward him and gave him his change. He took it and went to the small table by the window, the one that looked directly out at the empty storefront that used to be his, our old bakery. He sat there for a long time, just stirring his coffee. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Finally, he took a bite of the muffin. He closed his eyes. He took another bite, slower this time. He finished the whole thing, then drank his coffee down in 2 gulps. He stood up, brought the empty plate and mug back to the counter, and finally met my eyes. "You were right, Mom," he said, his voice thick. "The muffins are better." It wasn't an apology for ruining my life, but I knew it was the only one he knew how to give. A few days later, I was looking at the small stack of cash in my tip jar. It felt wrong to keep it all for myself. I remembered Mrs. Gable from church, how she sometimes couldn't afford her bus fare. I took out a clean index card and a thumbtack. On the card, I wrote "coffee" and pinned it to the corkboard by the door. My friend Margaret came in and saw it. "What's that for, Eleanor?" "It's for the next person who looks like they could use a warm drink and a kind word," I said. "Kindness is like yeast, dear. A little bit makes everything rise." By the end of the week, the board was covered in little paper tickets. Muffin for a veteran. Cinnamon roll for a tired mom. Coffee for a student. People loved it. They would buy a treat for themselves and one for a stranger. The little bell I kept on the counter would ring every time we took a ticket down for someone, and the sound of it was sweeter than any profit margin. My little cafe was becoming more than a business. It was becoming a heart for our small town. I wondered what my son, the businessman, would think of that. The cafe was running so smoothly with Chloe's help that I started to feel a strange itch. It was the feeling of freedom. I hadn't taken a real vacation since my husband, George, passed away. I always had the bakery, the orders, the early mornings. Not anymore. I packed a small bag, mostly with books I'd been meaning to read. I drove myself 3 hours to the coast, to a little motel room with a balcony that smelled of salt and sea air. I left Chloe in charge. She was nervous, but I wasn't. "Everything is fine, Eleanor," she said when I called her the first evening. The sound of happy customers chattered in the background. "We sold out of the rolls by 8:30. "I knew you could handle it, dear," I said, smiling as I watched the waves. "Don't forget to water the fern." I spent a week walking on the sand, feeling the cold water on my ankles. I didn't think about flour or sugar or ovens. For the first time in 40 years, my hands just rested. I realized I wasn't just the owner of a cafe. I was Eleanor Vance, and I was finally getting to know her. When I got back, rested and calm, Sarah asked to see me. She didn't want to meet at the cafe. She asked if I would come to the senior center where she had started volunteering. I found her in the craft room, helping a man named Arthur untangle a knot of yarn. The air smelled of disinfectant and old paper. She bought us both a cup of watery tea from the machine. We sat on 2 vinyl chairs that squeaked every time we moved. "I met a woman here," Sarah began, staring into her cup. "Her son put her here, and he only visits on holidays. She told me. She said the worst part isn't being old, it's being invisible." Sarah finally looked at me, her eyes full of a sadness I hadn't seen before. "That's what we did to you, isn't it? We made you invisible." I reached over and put my hand on hers. It felt thin. "You're seeing now, Sarah," I said. "That's a start." Our relationship wasn't fixed, but it felt like we had finally laid a new foundation, one that wasn't built on guilt or obligation. One morning, I was sitting on my usual bench in the town square before opening the cafe. I was drinking my coffee and watching the sun climb over the rooftops. Across the street, men were taking down the last of the sleek, modern signs from my old bakery. The name The Flower Pot was gone for good. A new sign went up. It was painted in calm, peaceful letters. Sunrise Yoga Studio. Margaret came and sat beside me, handing me a section of the newspaper. "Well, look at that," she said, nodding toward the studio. "A new beginning." I watched as a young woman unlocked the door and began placing colourful, rolled-up mats in the window. There was no ghost of my old life there, no bitterness. "I suppose that's one way to knead the dough," I said with a small smile. The past was finally just the past. It had no power over me anymore. My future was right here, in my hands, warm like my coffee cup. I hosted a small party at the cafe for what I now called my chosen family. It was the 1-year anniversary of Eleanor's nook. I'd strung up little white fairy lights that twinkled against the windows, and the whole place smelled of the special lemon and lavender cake I'd baked just for us. The sound of happy chatter and the gentle clinking of coffee cups filled the small room. Mr. Henderson raised his cup. "To Eleanor," he said, his voice warm. She reminded us all that the best things are still made with love. Everyone murmured their agreement. Chloe, my young assistant, came and put her arm around my shoulders. "I can't thank you enough for this, Eleanor, for everything." I patted her hand, looking around at the smiling faces of Margaret, the bank teller, and a dozen other regulars. "We did this together," I said, and I meant it. This is our place. In that moment, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the oven. A few days later, I was sitting at my kitchen table, sorting through a small pile of mail. There was a bill for my Medicare supplement, a seed catalogue, and a thin, crisp envelope with my name written in a familiar scrawl. It was from my eldest grandchild, Michael, who was away at college. My hands felt a little shaky as I opened it. The hum of my old refrigerator was the only sound in the room. I read the short letter once, and then again. "Grandma," he wrote, "I got the first check from the trust you set up. Thank you. Dad." Well, Dad doesn't really get it. But I do. I'm so proud of you for standing up for yourself. Tears pricked my eyes, but they were happy tears. I folded the letter and held it to my chest. This was the validation I never knew I needed. It wasn't about hurting my children. It was about protecting the future. The letter made me think about my legacy and what else I might want to leave behind. That evening, after we had cleaned up the cafe, Chloe and I were sitting in the quiet. The air still smelled faintly of yeast and sugar. My old leather-bound recipe book was on the counter, its pages soft with age. "That book is like a treasure chest," Chloe said, her voice soft. I ran my hand over the worn cover. "Some treasures are meant to be shared," I said, thinking of Michael's letter. "A few of them, anyway." Chloe's eyes lit up. "Are you thinking of, publishing them?" A smile touched my lips. "I think it's time for a little cookbook," I decided right then. Nothing fancy, just a small gift to the town that gave me a second chance. I knew I wouldn't include my deepest secrets, the ones that made my cinnamon rolls truly mine. Some things still had to be earned. The following Sunday, I was in my small garden, my hands covered in dirt as I pruned my rose bushes. The sun felt good on my back. My phone buzzed in my apron pocket, and I was surprised to see Mark's name on the screen. I wiped my hands on my jeans and answered. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Just calling to check in?" His voice still had that stiff, awkward quality. "Hello, Mark. Everything is fine here," I replied, snipping a dead leaf from a stem. "How is the new job?" "It's fine." There was a long pause, and I could hear him breathing on the other end. "Listen, I'm glad you're doing well." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was something. "Thank you, dear," I said simply. "I'm glad too." When the call ended, I looked at my hands, covered in the rich, dark soil. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a big announcement. It was a quiet, slow-growing thing, just like my garden. I sat alone at my favorite table in the cafe. It was 5 in the morning, long before the sun would rise. The only light came from the street lamps outside, casting long, soft shadows across the clean floor. The low hum of the coolers was a comforting sound. My leather-bound recipe book was open on the table beside my steaming cup of tea. I didn't feel old. I didn't feel angry. I felt settled. This little shop, this new life, it was all mine. I had built it not from bitterness, but from what I had left. I had built it from flour and butter and a refusal to become invisible. The first pale light of dawn began to touch the buildings across the town square. My town square. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The warmth spread through me, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was completely and peacefully home.